I signed those marriage papers knowing he hated me, knowing I was just a weapon in his war against his ex. But what he didn't know? I had my own reasons for saying yes, and neither of us expected what happened when spite turned into something we couldn't control. If you've ever wondered whether love can bloom from the darkest intentions, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this story gets messy, real, and surprisingly beautiful. Let's dive in. 6 months ago, I was nobody special. Just another pharmaceutical sales rep grinding through 12-hour days, fighting for commissions and trying to keep my head above water. My life revolved around quotas, client meetings, and making sure my little brother could stay in college without drowning in debt. Love, romance, those were luxuries I'd written off after my last boyfriend decided I was too focused on work and not enough on him. Translation: he wanted someone who'd make him the center of her universe, and I had bills to pay and a family counting on me. The night everything changed, I was working a charity gala my company had sponsored. Not as a guest, mind you. I was there to schmooze doctors and hospital administrators, hand out branded pens, and pretend I enjoyed networking. I was exhausted. My feet were killing me in heels I'd bought on clearance, and I was counting down the minutes until I could leave. That's when I saw him across the room. Tall, commanding presence, custom suit that probably cost more than my car. He was surrounded by people, but he looked utterly bored by all of them. Our eyes met for just a second, and I looked away. Men like that lived in a different world, and I had no interest in pretending otherwise. Then he approached me. Direct, no small talk. "You look like someone who appreciates honesty, so I'm going to be blunt. I need a wife for 6 months and I'll pay you $200,000. I actually laughed. I thought it was a joke, maybe some weird pickup line from a man who'd had too much champagne. But his face didn't change. He pulled out a business card, and that's when I realized who he was. One of the youngest real estate moguls in the city, known for turning abandoned properties into luxury developments. His face had been on the cover of business magazines. And he was completely serious. I should have walked away, should have told him he was out of his mind. But $200,000? That was my brother's surgery. That was every credit card paid off. That was breathing room I hadn't had since our parents died, and I became responsible for everything. So I took his card and told him I'd think about it. He simply nodded and walked away, like he already knew I'd call. When we met 3 days later at his attorney's office, he laid it all out. His ex-fiancée had left him 6 months earlier. She'd called him cold, emotionally unavailable, incapable of real love. Then she'd married his biggest competitor in a wedding that made every society page in the city. He wanted to show her that he'd moved on, that he was perfectly capable of commitment. He wanted her to see him happy with someone else, to regret walking away. And I was perfect for the role precisely because I was nothing like her. She was old money, a fashion designer with connections and pedigree. I was working class, ambitious in a different way, and most importantly, I was black. He wanted the contrast to be stark, unmistakable. He wanted it to hurt. I want you to understand something. I knew exactly what he was doing. I knew I was being used as a prop in someone else's revenge fantasy, and it made me angry. But I also knew what that money meant for my family. My brother needed surgery on his knee from a basketball injury, or his scholarship was gone. My credit cards were maxed from funeral expenses I was still paying off. And maybe, just maybe, part of me wanted to know what it felt like to live in that world, even if it was fake. So I signed the contract. 6 months. Public appearances as needed. Separate bedrooms. No emotional entanglement. Payment in full after the contract expired. The wedding was exactly what you'd expect. Small, cold, transactional, his lawyer and assistant as witnesses. I wore a simple cream dress I'd bought that morning. He wore the same expression he'd worn when we met, calculated and distant. When the officiant said we could kiss, it was the briefest touch of lips, more business than romance. And just like that, I became Mrs. Dalton Pierce. Moving into his penthouse felt surreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that probably cost more than I'd made in the last year, and enough space that we barely had to see each other. He showed me to my room, explained that his housekeeper would handle meals and cleaning, and told me he'd let me know when I was needed for appearances. Then he disappeared into his home office, and I sat on the edge of a bed worth more than my car, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The first month was performances, dinner parties where I smiled and played the adoring wife, gallery openings where his hand rested possessively on my lower back, a weekend charity auction where his ex-fiancée showed up dripping in diamonds, her new husband's arm around her waist. I saw the way Dalton's jaw tightened when he spotted them. I felt his grip on my hand become almost painful, and I played my part, leaning into him, laughing at something he'd said, making sure she saw us, making sure it looked real. But here's the thing about pretending. Sometimes the lines get blurry. It started small. He began making coffee for both of us in the morning, remembering that I took mine with cream and too much sugar. I'd ask about his day during our quiet dinners at home, and he'd actually answer, not just give me the sanitized version for public consumption. One night, at a particularly stuffy dinner party, someone made a comment, one of those subtle, polite, absolutely racist remarks about how exotic I looked, how surprising our pairing was. Before I could respond, Dalton's voice cut through the conversation like ice. He didn't raise his tone, but every word was deliberate, making it crystal clear that disrespect toward me wouldn't be tolerated. We left immediately after, and in the car ride home, he apologized. Not for the person, but for putting me in that position. It was the first time he seemed to see me as a person, not a chess piece. Month 3, something shifted. I'd started working from his home office when he was in meetings, and one afternoon his assistant had a family emergency. A crisis erupted with a major development deal, and I found myself on the phone with contractors and city officials, managing the chaos because someone had to. When Dalton came home that evening, ready to deal with the disaster, I handed him an organized breakdown of everything I'd handled. He stared at me for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe, or surprise that I was more than what he'd assumed. That night we stayed up late talking about the business, about his vision for the company, about my pharmaceutical work. And for the first time, it felt like a real conversation between equals. The attraction crept up on both of us. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. I'd find myself noticing the way his shoulders relaxed when he came home, how his rare smiles made him look younger, less burdened. We developed routines that had nothing to do with the contract, morning coffee together before he left for the office, evening walks through the building's rooftop garden, nights where we'd end up on the couch, talking about everything and nothing until midnight. The walls were coming down, and neither of us knew how to stop it or if we even wanted to. His ex noticed. Of course she did. She started appearing at more of the same events, always watching us, always hovering nearby. At a gallery opening in month 4, she cornered me in the bathroom. Her voice was sugar-sweet and absolutely venomous. She told me I was playing a role I'd never truly fit into, that Dalton would tire of me once the novelty wore off, that I was embarrassing myself trying to belong in their world. And I looked at this woman, dripping in privilege and entitlement, and I felt nothing but pity. I told her that belonging somewhere was never about fitting into someone else's expectations. I told her that maybe Dalton's problem wasn't being emotionally unavailable. Maybe his problem was being with someone who never saw beyond her own reflection. Then I walked out with my head high and found Dalton standing just outside, having heard enough to understand what had happened. The look in his eyes that night was different. It was pride, protectiveness, want. We barely spoke on the ride home, but the air between us was electric, and when we walked through his door, we both stopped pretending. He kissed me first, but I kissed him back. 6 months of tension, of stolen glances, of pretending not to feel what was building between us, it all broke that night. And when we finally pulled apart, breathless and tangled together, I saw fear in his eyes matching my own. Because this wasn't part of the contract. This wasn't supposed to happen. We'd broken the only rule that mattered. The morning after was awkward in ways neither of us knew how to handle. He retreated into that cold businessman persona, all clipped words and professional distance. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I'd shown him something real and he'd rejected it. We had 1 month left on the contract, and suddenly it felt like a countdown to something ending that had barely begun. I threw myself into work, taking extra meetings, staying away from the penthouse as much as possible. He worked late at the office, and when we were home, we moved around each other like strangers. Then his ex started spreading rumors, whispers that our marriage was fake, that I was being paid, that it was all a show to make her jealous. His board started asking questions. Investors were concerned about his judgment, and I realized that my presence in his life, the very thing that was supposed to make him look stable and committed, was now threatening everything he'd built. I made my decision. I couldn't stay in a situation where I was becoming a liability. I couldn't stay with a man who'd touched me like I mattered and then treated me like a mistake. My pride wouldn't allow it, and my heart couldn't take it. I was packing when he came home early. I'd already called my brother, arranged for a moving company, mentally prepared myself to walk away from the fantasy and back to my real life. Dalton stood in the doorway of my room, watching me fold clothes, and I waited for him to say something cold, something that would make leaving easier. Instead, he asked me to stop. Just stop. He told me that it had started as revenge, as the ugliest possible motivation for choosing a partner. He admitted that he'd picked me specifically to hurt someone else, to prove a point, to win a game he shouldn't have been playing. But somewhere in the pretending, it became real. Somewhere between morning coffee and late-night conversations, between defending me at parties and watching me handle his business crisis, he'd stopped acting. He'd fallen, and it terrified him, because his ex had been right. He was emotionally unavailable. He was difficult to love, and he was proving it by pushing me away the moment things got real. I wanted to accept that, wanted to fall into his arms and let the fairy tale continue. But I'd spent too many years fighting to be seen as more than what people assumed about me. I wasn't going to be anyone's consolation prize or proof of concept. I told him that I wouldn't stay with a man who only knew how to feel something when it was packaged as rebellion. I told him I deserved someone who chose me first, not someone who chose me to spite someone else and accidentally caught feelings. I walked out of that penthouse with my head high and my heart breaking. And I didn't look back. 2 weeks of silence followed. I moved back into my small apartment, returned to my regular life, and tried to forget what it felt like to live in that world. My brother called every day, worried. My friends wanted details I couldn't give, and I threw myself into work, determined to prove that I didn't need Dalton's money or his world to be successful. The payment hit my account as scheduled. Contract fulfilled, transaction complete. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like an ending. Then my brother's college graduation happened. It was a small ceremony, family only, at the university an hour outside the city. I was sitting with distant cousins, cheering as my brother walked across that stage, proud of everything he'd accomplished. And in the crowd, standing at the back like he didn't quite belong, was Dalton. He wasn't supposed to be there. He had no reason to be there. But after the ceremony, as my brother celebrated with friends, Dalton approached me with an uncertainty I'd never seen in him before. He told me he'd spent 2 weeks thinking about what his ex had said, about being emotionally unavailable. He'd realized she was right, but not in the way she meant. He wasn't incapable of love. He was terrified of it. Terrified of being vulnerable, of giving someone the power to hurt him, of failing at the one thing that mattered more than business success. He'd built walls so high that when she left, he'd convinced himself it was her fault, her inability to see his worth. But with me, those walls had crumbled without him noticing. And when he finally realized he was in love, actually in love, he'd panicked and done exactly what she'd accused him of. He'd shut down. He wasn't asking me to come back to the penthouse. He wasn't offering another contract or a transaction. He was asking permission to prove himself, to court me properly, to build something real from the ruins of what started as revenge. He told me his ex had shown up at his office, wanting reconciliation, wanting to try again, and he'd turned her down without hesitation, because somewhere in our 6 months of pretending, I'd become the only real thing in his carefully constructed life. I didn't make it easy for him. I made him work for it. Made him show up for regular dates at normal restaurants, not just expensive showpieces. Made him meet my friends, navigate my world, prove that he could exist outside his carefully controlled environment. Made him sit through Sunday dinners with my extended family, where nobody cared about his net worth or his business deals. And slowly, carefully, I let myself trust that this was real. 3 months of actual dating. 3 months of learning each other without contracts or performances. 3 months of him showing me that he could be vulnerable, could apologize, could grow. He started therapy, working through the walls he'd built. I started believing that maybe, just maybe, 2 people who came together for all the wrong reasons could build something right. When he proposed the second time, it was nothing like the first. No lawyers, no contracts, no cold transactions. Just him, on one knee in my tiny apartment, with a ring he'd chosen himself and a voice that shook with genuine emotion, asking if I'd marry him again, for real this time, for love. Our second wedding was small, intimate, filled with people who actually mattered to us. My brother walked me down the aisle. His housekeeper, who'd become a friend, cried through the whole ceremony, and when we kissed, it wasn't brief or transactional. It was real. A year later, I can tell you that marriage built on spite and revenge probably shouldn't work. The foundation was all wrong, the motivations were ugly, and we both brought our worst selves to the beginning. But sometimes, the wrong start leads to the right ending. Sometimes 2 broken people find each other in the messiest possible way and decide to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Dalton learned to be vulnerable, to let someone in, to believe he was worthy of real love. I learned to trust again, to believe that not every man would see me as too much or not enough. We're not perfect. We still fight. He still retreats sometimes when things get hard, and I still put up walls when I feel vulnerable. But we work through it. We chose each other, really chose each other, beyond contracts and revenge and all the ugly reasons people come together. Sometimes the wrong reasons lead us to the right person. What do you think? Can a relationship that starts with revenge ever become real love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, smash that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe for more stories about love that defies the odds. Remember, your story isn't over just because it had a messy beginning. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.